Dangerous truth. Australia's housing market is in freefall, and it's taking the great Australian dream down with it. Prices have skyrocketed, while wages have frozen, leaving everyday Australians trapped. People are fighting for a roof over their heads, desperate to survive in a market that's out of control. What used to be a promise of prosperity has turned into a deadly game of survival. Homeownership is slipping further and further out of reach. This is the brutal reality of a country on the brink. What went wrong? Let's uncover the shocking truth. Australia used to be the land of opportunity, but now, the great Australian dream is nothing but a shattered illusion crumbling under the weight of a housing crisis that's nothing short of catastrophic. For decades, owning a home was a promise, a dream, passed down from parents to their children. It was the bedrock of the Australian identity. You could work hard, save, and buy a home, and that was the mantra. But now, after years of mismanagement, that dream is slipping through the fingers of millions. And here's where it gets brutal. The numbers don't lie. The cost of a home in Australia has more than doubled in the last 13 years. In 2011, the median cost of a house was under $500,000. Fast forward to 2024, and that same house is pushing $1 million. $1 million. And wages? They haven't kept up. A worker today is earning only a fraction of what they need to actually afford a house. How is this even possible? Simple. It's a rigged game, and the system is playing you. It's not just the prices, it's the systemic greed that has made owning a home impossible for the average Aussie. Politicians have been feeding the public lies, offering promises of solutions that are nothing more than band-aids on a gaping wound. They're saying, we'll fix this, we'll build more homes, but the reality is that they've been failing for decades. Every year, the crisis deepens. So where's the outrage? Where's the demand for accountability? Why are we still putting up with this? Let me break it down for you. Sydney and Melbourne, two of Australia's largest cities, account for nearly 40% of the population. Yet, they're consistently ranked among the least affordable cities on the planet. Think about that. The world is watching, and they're witnessing a nation that was once a model of prosperity, now on the brink of collapse. To buy a house in these cities, it takes over 10 times the average annual income. You know what that means? It means that the dream of homeownership is reserved for only a select few. The rest, you're locked out. But it gets worse. The rents, out of control. Families are being forced into the rental market because buying a home is no longer an option. And it's not just a few people scrambling to find a place to live. Entire lines of people are waiting for apartment inspections. There's literally a queue to see if you can even get the chance to rent. Is this the kind of country you signed up for? Is this the nation you thought you were living in? Because it's not just a housing crisis anymore. It's a human rights crisis, and still the government does nothing. In the face of this crisis, Australians are waking up to a horrifying truth: they're being lied to. The promises of homeownership have been replaced by a generation of renters who will never own a piece of land, never build wealth. They'll pay into a system that leaves them stagnant while property owners continue to rake in profits. If you think that's fair, then wake up. This is no longer a simple issue of housing, it's an issue of class warfare. So why are the politicians still sitting idly by? The government isn't just standing still, they're actively enabling this crisis. Why? Because they benefit from it. The real estate industry, the banks, the investors, they're all in on it. It's a machine that profits off the suffering of everyday Australians. And the government, well, they've turned their backs on you because it's easier to pander to the wealthy elite. Why? Because they've become complicit in the system's corruption. Do you feel it? The anger building, that sense that you've been robbed? Because it's not just a feeling, it's the truth. This used to be your country. You had a chance to own something, to build a future. But now you're stuck in a system where homeownership is a pipe dream for all but the wealthy. If we don't speak out, if we don't demand change, this is it. This is the future. The dream is dead, and it's time for us to make some noise. The government doesn't get it, but you do. You know what's at stake here? And if you're ready to fight for a future that's not just about surviving, but actually thriving, then it's time to demand more. Let me tell you something they don't want you to know. The housing crisis in Australia isn't just a consequence of poor planning, it's the result of pure greed. You see, housing is no longer about providing shelter or creating stability. It's a business, a multi-billion-dollar industry where profits rule and people are nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet. In the 1980s, Australia made a dangerous shift, one that would reshape the future for generations. Housing was no longer seen as a fundamental right. Instead, it became a commodity, something to invest in, flip, and exploit for maximum gain. And while the politicians were busy painting this as a smart economic move, what they were really doing was handing the keys of the housing market to corporate investors and property moguls. Here's the kicker. They encouraged it. Through tax incentives like negative gearing and capital gains discounts, the government created a system where investors were rewarded for buying up properties, not just one or two, but entire portfolios. The goal wasn't to live in these homes. It was to rent them out or hold on to them until the market exploded, cashing in on the misery of everyday Australians. And the worst part, it worked. By the early 2000s, investors controlled a massive portion of the housing market. Today, nearly 20% of Australian properties are owned by investors. Think about that. 1 in 5 homes is off the table for families looking to buy because someone else is hoarding it for profit. And while investors were getting richer, renters were paying the price, literally. The competition for rentals skyrocketed, pushing prices to insane levels. In some cities like Sydney and Melbourne, rents have risen by 50% in just 5 years. That's not a market correcting itself. That's a market in chaos. But here's the dark secret they're hiding. It's not just investors fueling this mess. And the government itself is one of the biggest culprits. Over the last 40 years, public housing, a lifeline for low-income families, has been systematically dismantled. Back in 1978, the government built 20,000 public housing units a year. Today, that number has plummeted to just 3,000. Let that sink in. At a time when the need for affordable housing is at its highest, the government has all but abandoned its duty to provide it. Why? Because it doesn't fit the new narrative. Public housing doesn't make money. It doesn't attract investors. So instead of building homes for people who need them, the focus shifted to creating opportunities for the wealthy to expand their empires. And if you think this is just incompetence, think again. The policies that created this crisis weren't accidents, they were deliberate. Take negative gearing, for example. On the surface, it seems like a harmless tax break, but in reality, it's a tool that allows investors to write off losses on rental properties, making it easier for them to buy more homes while ordinary Australians are locked out of the market. It's no wonder then that Australia now has some of the least affordable housing in the world. In fact, it's second only to Hong Kong. Let that sink in for a moment. The country with endless land and resources has managed to make its housing market as inaccessible as a tiny island with virtually no space. But here's where it gets really twisted. The banks are complicit in this too. For years, they handed out loans like candy, pushing people to take on massive debt just to afford a home. And during the pandemic, when interest rates hit record lows, they went into overdrive, encouraging buyers to take on even more debt. But now that interest rates are rising again, guess who's paying the price? It's not the banks. It's not the investors. It's the everyday Australians who are drowning in mortgage stress. You might think, surely the government will step in to fix this. But here's the ugly truth. They don't want to. Because the housing market is too valuable to them. It generates billions in taxes. And the politicians who claim to care about affordability are the same ones profiting from skyrocketing property prices. So where does that leave us? Stuck in a system where the rich keep getting richer and everyone else is left to fight over scraps. It's a cruel irony. The very dream that was supposed to create wealth and stability has become a weapon of inequality. If you're not angry yet, you should be. This isn't just a housing crisis. It's a moral failure. And the people who created it, the investors, the banks, the politicians, they're counting on you to stay quiet. But you don't have to, because if there's one thing they fear more than anything, it's a public that refuses to accept their lies. So what are you going to do about it? Let's stop sugarcoating it. The great Australian dream is dead, and the truth is far uglier than anyone is willing to admit. What we're witnessing isn't just a housing crisis, it's the erosion of a national identity. Australia has gone from being a land of opportunity where homeownership was a birthright to a battleground where only the wealthy survive. And the fallout, it's reshaping the country in ways most Australians aren't even prepared for. This isn't just about housing anymore. It's about power. Who gets to live where? who gets to dream, who gets to thrive, and who's left behind, forced to fight over crumbs in a system designed to keep them exactly where they are at the bottom. Let me paint a picture for you. In the 1950s, Australia was a country built on aspiration. A detached house on a quarter-acre block wasn't just a dream, it was an achievable reality for millions. The suburbs were sprawling, the cars were roaring, and the Holden was a national icon. Homeownership wasn't just about having a roof over your head. It was a symbol of freedom, of success, of a life well lived. But look at Australia now. That same quarter-acre block. It's a myth. The sprawling suburbs have turned into overpriced wastelands where the average house costs 10 times the annual income. In Sydney and Melbourne, you'll find young families packed into apartments smaller than their parents' garages, paying rent so high they barely scrape by each month. Forget the garden, forget the car, forget the dream. Here's the cold, hard truth. Australia has become a playground for the wealthy, and the rest of the population? They're stuck playing a game they can never win. The rise of the renter class is one of the most alarming trends of this century. More Australians than ever are renting, not because they want to, but because they have no other choice. And renting in Australia isn't just expensive, it's brutal. Landlords wield immense power, raising rents at will, evicting tenants with minimal notice, and treating properties like cash cows instead of homes. And here's the kicker. Renting isn't just a temporary phase anymore. For a growing number of Australians, it's a permanent reality. The dream of owning a home is so far out of reach that many have simply given up. A full-time worker on minimum wage now spends up to 68% of their income on rent. That's not just unsustainable, it's criminal. But it gets worse. This isn't just about housing affordability, it's about social division. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is widening at a terrifying pace. Homeowners are sitting on properties worth millions, watching their wealth skyrocket with every passing year, while renters are stuck in a cycle of financial instability, unable to save, unable to invest, unable to build a future. Let's talk about class warfare. That's what this is turning into. On one side, you have the property-owning elite profiting from a system rigged in their favor. On the other side, you have the growing renter underclass, working longer hours for less pay, trapped in a system designed to keep them from ever getting ahead. And what about the government? The so-called leaders of this country, they're complicit. They've allowed this crisis to spiral out of control, prioritizing short-term economic gains over long-term stability. Immigration policies flood the country with new residents, increasing demand while construction stagnates. Tax laws favor the rich, encouraging property speculation instead of home ownership. And public housing? Practically non-existent. Here's the most disturbing part. This isn't just affecting individuals, it's tearing apart communities. When people can't afford to live near their families, near their jobs, near their support networks, what happens? They're forced to move further and further out, isolating themselves in pursuit of affordability. Suburbs become ghost towns. Inner cities become fortresses for the rich. The fabric of Australian society is unraveling thread by thread. And let's not ignore the psychological toll. The pressure to buy a home, to achieve the dream, is crushing an entire generation. Millennials and Gen Z are drowning in anxiety, working themselves to the bone just to afford a down payment they'll likely never save. Meanwhile, older generations sit on their fortunes, blaming the youth for not trying hard enough, for drinking too much coffee, for not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The Australian dream was never about the house. It was about what the house represented, a stable, secure, prosperous life. But that life is slipping further and further out of reach, leaving millions of Australians questioning their place in a country they no longer recognize. So what happens next? Do Australians rise up and demand change? Do they hold their leaders accountable, challenge the system, fight for their future? Or do they give up, resign themselves to a lifetime of renting, of struggling, of surviving instead of thriving? The answer lies in the hands of the people. But one thing is clear, the Australian dream, as we knew it, is gone. And if something doesn't change soon, it won't just be the dream that collapses, it'll be the very foundation of Australian society. Picture this. It's 2030. The sun sets over a glittering skyline of high-rise apartments, casting long shadows over streets once brimming with promise. But look closer, beneath the neon glow and polished facades lies a nation on the brink of collapse. Families huddle in crumbling motels, their lives packed into suitcases, evicted without warning. The lucky ones cram into overstuffed rental units, splitting a single bedroom between three strangers. And the unlucky, they line the outskirts of the city in makeshift tent cities, hidden in plain sight. This isn't fiction. This is the inevitable trajectory if Australia continues down this path. Do you feel that chill? It's the cold reality of a system that has failed its people. It starts with the numbers, a staggering 1 in 10 Australians projected to face homelessness. It starts with the stories, a mother working 3 jobs to pay rent, forced to choose between groceries or electricity. But it ends with something far darker, a society where owning a home becomes the privilege of the elite, while the rest of the population becomes modern-day serfs, paying exorbitant sums to landlords who see them as nothing more than dollar signs. But let me make it more visceral. Imagine waking up at dawn in a sprawling outer suburb, your children still asleep on a fold-out couch. For your morning commute, 2 hours each way because the only affordable rent is far from the city, far from opportunity. By the time you return home, they're already in bed, another day of their childhood stolen by an unrelenting system. And it gets worse. As rents rise, wages stagnate, and inflation grips the economy. The cracks in Australian society widen. So resentment festers. People are forced to make unthinkable choices. Do they move to rural areas, abandoning their dreams, or stay in the city, slipping further into debt? And do they speak out, risking everything, or do they suffer in silence, knowing the system wasn't built for them to win? Australia is a land of abundance, yet its people are being suffocated by greed. The question is no longer whether the dream is alive, it's whether the people are. If this doesn't make you furious, what will? The time to act is now. Fight for your home. Fight for your future. Fight for your Australia.